Hi and welcome for this special GenCon Online live stream on Homo Ludens, the channel on history and board games. Thanks for joining us this morning. For those of you who are regular Homo Ludens viewers, this is a bit of a special show, as for this time I will leave the keys to Jason Carr from GMT to run the panel, and I will just be a guest. And we will be discussing the future of the Coin and Irregular Conflict Series. If you're watching this show after the live stream, I will have added some time codes in the description so you can navigate through the content. And if you're watching us live, remember that you should feel free to ask questions to the panel by typing them in the live chat. And for the last part of the show, I will bring them in and Jason will be asking the questions to the panel. That's pretty much it for an introduction, and let's start the show.
Of course, wouldn't be an online panel without at least a few technical difficulties.
Yes,
hopefully
good.
That's the worst.
You're unmuted. I will let you know.
Welcome everybody to the GenCon Online panel. My name is Jason Carr. I work for GMT Games. I'm very pleased to have Volko with me. What we're going to do today is have a quick interview with Volko, just to kind of set the stage about the Coin series generally, and then we're going to bring some of our designers on board to talk about future games in the series as well as games in our Irregular Conflict series. So, Volko, how are you doing today?
I'm very well. Hi, Jason.
So it's been almost 10 years since the first Coin game came out, Andean Abyss. Right. Tell me a little bit about why you wanted to make a board game about counterinsurgency and irregular conflicts.
Yeah, well, I was conscious from my day job as an analyst that irregular warfare, internal wars, rebellions, all these things that are not big conventional wars, and in the modern context, insurgency, are very, very common in history, across the world, in modern times, anywhere you look. But in board wargaming, we were so focused on the big industrial wars and the big force on force and purely, military aspects of those. And so I knew there was a room for a series that looked at insurgency. And in that way, because insurgencies do this by their nature, bring out all the interrelationships among military affairs, factional politics, economic attrition, and all of that.
Yeah. Now, you chose Colombia to be the place where you modeled this originally. Can you tell me a little bit about why Colombia?
Yeah, and my original idea was a 4-volume series and something on every, in 4 different regions of the world. So Latin America insurgency was a must. And I had heard a great lecture by an expert on the topic in general of irregular warfare, but insurgency in Colombia in particular, and that was Tom Marks, who was then at National Defense University, using Colombia as a case study of how a domestic counterinsurgency had faced down multiple threats to the state and come out in a fairly good way. And I was very interested, first of all, in how did they do that? How did the counterinsurgents win in that case? And secondly, because there were multiple insurgent factions, it had this really rich possibility of many factions, all of which were pursuing their own objectives, their own vision of the future of Colombia, interacting with each other in all ways, enemies dealing with each other against a third enemy and so forth, that the possibilities there for an asymmetric gameplay were very, very rich in the story of Colombia in the 1990s and early 2000s.
Yeah, I think that as we look down farther in the series and we look at some of the other games, that multi-faction approach becomes one of the hallmarks of the series. And at least in my reading, it seems that every time that there's a power vacuum, there's many different factions that rise to try to fill it. So in reading about, for just as an example, the Syrian civil war, where there's hundreds of factions, I think that element of Coin rings very true.
And it's exactly so. If this is the way I view all mass human affairs, there are always factions. There's always groups within any organization that have overlapping but not identical incentives. and they all tend to pursue their own ends with their own ways and their own means, right? And so I kind of understood the world that way. I mean, in a way, I'm trained to try to understand the world in that way. And it was a little frustrating for me that in most war games, well, there's this army and there's that army, and you're trying to understand what happened by the interaction of those two armies as unitary. But actually, if you really want to understand, for example, what was going on the Eastern Front in World War II, for example, you really ought to look at the Wehrmacht and the Nazi regime and all of the factions within that have their own purposes, and the same thing on the Soviet side. And yeah, those two sets of factions are enemies, but they're not exactly completely aligned in themselves, right? And so I just thought board games had more potential than had been realized to explore that inherently interfactional nature of humanity.
Yeah, one thing that I like, Amabel Holland from Holland Spiel talks a lot about literalizing concepts in board games, and that's exactly what happens when you have 4 factions at a table. You literalize the divide between them by making different players control them. So I think that's excellent. So tell me a little bit about the features of Andean Abyss that you think are core to the model of Coin. So one of them is obviously the factions, because you just spoke to that. What else?
Well, the other is the recognizing ends, ways, and means. The elements of strategy are potentially different for everybody. So ends means the victory conditions, and the idea that you're not only trying to achieve your own, but you have to watch all the other factions' measures of their own success, and take that seriously. So asymmetrical victory conditions. Then in terms of ways, those are the mechanics, the different actions. So everybody should have at least a somewhat different menu of actions if we're going to realistically show that different parties, different factions go about things in different ways to achieve their ends. And of course, the means being different, just the number of bits and so forth. And then to mesh all that together, what I wanted to do in the Coin series was leverage the really powerful interactions between action menus and event cards that came from card-driven games, which was my design and hobby background too, but without the focus on hand management. Because while that's a lot of fun and interesting for gameplay, hand management, it kind of tends to take you a little bit away from what's happening on the board geographically, where the force is and what's the status of the human terrain. And so I wanted to kind of bring the player's eyes back to that and have the cards be something that are a little bit more off to the side, and yet nevertheless, bring in the ability of event cards to just, show political, economic, personality, technology, weather, whatever kind of thing that's influencing the core conflict.
Yeah. Now, in CDGs, a lot of times the political aspects of the conflict are abstracted into the cards. I'm thinking about Wilderness War as a good example of this, whereas
yes.
There are political impacts to raids. There are political impacts to recruitment of forces, but those tend to either be reflected in the victory track with raids or with cards, specifically for the French regulars, I'm thinking.
Yeah.
With Coin, it's on the board. You have spaces that have an alignment and a control status, and that is how the political element of the game plays out. Can you speak a little bit to the political model in Coin and how you thought about that?
So this goes back to insurgency and counterinsurgency theory, and the idea that the center of gravity is the population, control of the population and its loyalties that either gives the government legitimacy, which is its ultimate goal, or robs the government of legitimacy and gives support from the people to the insurgents who eventually become strong enough militarily to overcome the government forces. So that's a common idea, I think, throughout counterinsurgency thinking, that you have to think of the population as your main area of contest. So that's why you get situations tactically where the counterinsurgents are told to seize that hill, go seize that hill. Okay, you got that hill. Okay, well, now move on. We're giving up that hill, because it's not the hill, right, that's important. It's, are we attriting the guerrillas enough so the guerrillas can't threaten the population in this area to take their loyalty to them away from us? So geographic terrain is in there, but it's the human terrain, and including the political human terrain, who are these people looking to protect them, lead them, solve their problems, apply justice in this particular area, that you have to cover, because it is so important to both insurgent strategy and counterinsurgency. So that was a given, and it wasn't, at all original to me. In fact, go back to Mark Herman's early CDGs. If you think about the American Revolution as an insurgency, there were political control markers before, Wilderness War just didn't happen to need that for that, what I was focused on there. And then, of course, Brian Train's work on games about, like his first game about the French-Algerian struggle in the 50s and 60s. Again, the idea that local popular sympathy and the impact of forces and operations on those sympathies are a key metric of who's winning. That's just so important to insurgency. It had to be in the Coin series.
Yeah, I love that. I love your call out to We the People, Washington's War. Mark tweeted out at one point his handwritten design notes for that game, and right at the top it says, "The American Revolution is an insurgency."
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that. Oh, yeah. Well, there you have it.
So absolutely there.
So tell Harold his efforts legitimate after all.
Yeah, Liberty or Death is clearly right in the mainstream of interpretation for the American Revolution. So one thing I've noticed about your work, Volko, is you like to work in series. So obviously you have several series to your name. Coin series is one of them. Your newer series, the Levian Campaign series, and then you also have a couple CDGs. Is that just a part of the way that you work, that you think in terms of systems and use the systems multiple times, or is it just kind of a happy accident?
It may be some of both. I think a part of it also is the product of the fact that I am trying to fill in troughs in the repertoire. That is, I kind of don't want to do another game on the East Front, because there are so many good options already out there. And maybe that's my own lack of self-confidence that I can compete, with.
So we shouldn't expect a bulge game from you?
No, you wouldn't expect a bulge game from me unless it were some completely, some perspective that I can't already play, because I'm starting to design because I want to play that game and it doesn't exist, right? And so for example, with insurgency, if I say, well, you know what, there are all of these stories to tell with regard to modern insurgencies and counterinsurgencies, and we have very few games that do that, then there's room for, which do I do? Because there's so many stories to tell. And I need to do some systems work to do the first one. And now immediately, and so before I could even effectively start my intended volume 2 after Colombia, which was going to be Portuguese Angola, someone who knew my work stepped forward and said, this would fit Cuba very well. And I'm like, okay, great, let's do Cuba, Jeff, and off we go, right? And so that's how I think the series not only happens, but prospers, because others can see there is stuff to be done here. There's new ground to plow.
Yeah.
And that goes back to my original interest in looking for virgin fields.
Yeah. Volko, I'll go ahead and editorialize for a second. I think that the success that you have with series comes from your ability to build both a mechanical toolbox for designers and a model for designers to leverage. And I think your games tend to shine on the modeling side, at least in my experience. And I love to see new ways to take a model and have it explain something that hasn't been explained very well in the past. And so I think that speaks to your comment about looking for new areas to game that haven't really been gamed before. And I think the Coin series has done that. It's funny because let's talk about that. So you mentioned Cuba Libre. And obviously, Brian Train's A Distant Plane that you did with him came after that. And then you went to something that was gamed constantly with Vietnam, but gamed it in a different way. That's not quite what would be expected of a Vietnam conflict. Do you have any kind of thoughts on how that evolution happened and how that kind of got the ball rolling?
To go to Vietnam, which had been, So Vietnam, to me, was the most, in my circles and in my consciousness, was sort of out of history the most famous, the granddaddy of insurgencies and counterinsurgencies. And in fact, part of my original interest in insurgency, before I was in any way professionally looking at that analytically, came from Nick Karp's Vietnam 1965, 1975,
Right.
done in 84, hugely original, very, in terms of models, very informative. In fact, my idea still of how Vietnam worked operationally and how guerrilla warfare works is influenced probably more by Nick Karp's game, done under Mark Herman's tutelage, I should mention, than probably anything I've read, or because the games are, because of the model aspect you mentioned, are so instructive and evocative. So Vietnam was a fascination of mine going back to my undergraduate years. But the way that project came up was actually Gene Billingsley saying, to me and Mark. So Mark has for a long time been thinking about a game on Vietnam. And if you two got together and co-designed something, Gene didn't say coin. If you two got together and co-designed something on Vietnam, we could, bring that to the table, right? We could finally take all of the thinking that Mark Herman has done about that conflict, which is a lot, to market. And Mark agreed, and we met and talked about his vision for the game. And we were originally talking about maybe a block game and a point-to-point and various things. But when he described his perspective on the conflict and what he wanted to do that games had not done, it was about the intra-Vietnamese aspects of the conflict, cultural aspects of the conflict, and what happens when outsiders come in as separate forces and take over the dynamics of the conflict. And as we thought about it, I was like, well, you're talking about Vietnam as a multifactional insurgency, counterinsurgency. You know what? I have a system for that. And Mark agreed immediately. And if you read what he's written about Fire in the Lake and about Vietnam, the idea that not only the U.S. and the ARVN were a bad marriage, but that the Southern and Northern communists, the VC and the NBA, were not identical in their ends, ways, and means. They were allied factions, and that history, for reasons of both the winners and the losers, those outside South Vietnam, history has downplayed the degree to which the VC and the NLF down there were their own thing. So Mark had that idea, that view of the conflict from his study of it before I ever did Andean Abyss. But it just was a natural fit to tell that story through this model. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad that it ended up being the game that it is. I think Fire in the Lake is probably the quintessential treatment on that topic in the last 15 years for board gaming. So it's been a lot of fun. I would be horribly punished by Gene if I did not mention that that Nick Karp's Vietnam is up for reprint at GMT Games on RP500. So you can go check that out and see the granddaddy that inspired so much thinking on this topic in board games. So Volko, this panel is called The Future of the Coin Series. We've talked almost entirely about the past up to this point. A lot of it is window dressing for the guys who are going to come out here in a minute. But I wanted to ask you, but we've talked about this before, and I know that when you set out to start the Coin Series, you didn't think that you were going to do a game about the Gallic tribes revolt, or that there would be a game about Roman Britain or nonviolent resistance in India. So obviously the series has gone many directions. Is there anything that you think hasn't been covered that would be ripe for innovation?
Well, there's so much. I mean, if you were to somehow graphically represent, here's what's been covered in world history, here's what's not been covered in world history, I mean, you'd have little dots in terms of what's covered, right? So I think that's the main, and of course the topic, the setting, as just we've been talking about with regard to Colombia or with Vietnam, how we as designers or thinkers about history imagine that this conflict worked is going to influence if we're designing simulation, it's going to influence the mechanics that we choose to use, right? It's going to lead to mechanical innovation because we need to solve problems of representing this new situation. And the new stories to tell, I mean, you know, they're virtually unlimited. And we still, I mean, I want the future of the coin series to be a part of what is already happening in historical board gaming. And that is, it's not that we're no longer going to do East Front World War II. Of course we are. But we realize that we can also break free from that to tell so many great stories that are underrepresented because of our focus on large conventional wars, right? Because we focused on that, we've looked at certain times in history and certain actors or places. Europe, wars involving Americans, and so on, right? If we break free from that and we look at the much more common internal irregular types of conflict, and we're willing to handle conflicts that cannot really be simulated or explained well without political, cultural, economic, and other factors alongside military, there's no end to the stories that we can discover that will be well told in a game that maybe had as its starting point the mechanics in Andean Abyss.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that answer. I think one person commented in the chat that irregular conflict has become more regular than regular conflict. And
well, yeah.
That's certainly been the theme of the 20th century in conflicts.
And by the way, I wouldn't even say has become, been.
There's always been,
It's our focus that says this is conventional and this is unconventional or irregular. That second basket has always been there and has always been more common, and I would say more a part of explaining where humanity went and how issues were resolved than it's just the sort of the big, flashy, occasional, highly decisive thing, the conventional war. Sure, I mean, it makes sense that we should want to study and understand that, but it's not the main pattern. It's the exception.
Yeah. Well, Volko, thank you so much for to set the stage here for the conversation and to teach us a little bit about the history of the coin series. Let's go ahead and bring Fred and Joe and Saverio out, and we can talk a little bit about their games, because they're taking what you've done and moving forward with it into new areas that I think are really interesting. So welcome, guys. So what I'd like to do is go through each one of the new three. I'd love to hear a little bit about what game you're working on, because each one of you has a game up on P500 with GMT Games. And then tell us a little bit about your experience with coin. Which coin volumes speak to you? What part of coin do you really love? So I'm going to kick us off, start with Fred. Fred, can you tell me a little bit about Gest of Robin Hood and your introduction to the coin series?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as you said, the game that I currently have on the P500 is not per se part of the coin series. Share a lot of the DNA, the coin series, obviously, and is the volume 2 in the Irregular Conflict series called the Gest of Robin Hood. And maybe reacting to one comment that was in the chat, and is actually one of those games that is not exactly a purely historical game. It's between history and fantasy, and we'll talk probably a bit more about that after. And I will explain a bit more why I wanted to approach it this way. My relationship with the coin series was the first coin game I bought was Colonial Twilight by Brian Train, because it was a topic that I felt close to and that I wanted to explore via gaming, and I was really excited about. But I found it like it was a pretty hard game to get into, especially as I was more used to hex and counter games. And it took me a while actually to get into coin games because it was so different from what I knew. And the thing that was really a pivotal event for me to get into coin games was the pandemic and the fact that I joined a Discord server called the Coin Player Discord server that I promote, by the way. You should definitely go there if you like coins or if you want to discover them, because we have a nice community to teach the coin games. And the thing that really, so that sense of community, of playing together or getting to know the games with others, was really what got me fully into the coin series. And a key game for that was Cuba Libre. I think Cuba Libre is an amazing game to discover the system. It is a bit more tight in terms of spaces. It is a bit more approachable. It has a scenario that is actually shorter, that enables newcomers to come in. And the decision space is a tiny bit smaller, which is just enough to get into the game. But then you realize how deep the game is, and it has that. It is wonderful because in that sense, it is easy to get into, but you keep discovering how you can use the different faction in new ways, and you keep having this sense of wonder when you play it. And then there is a lot of coin games that I enjoyed. After that, I started really enjoying actually Colonial Twilight. I really loved Indian Abyss, and it's Oddities because it was the first in the system, and there is a lot of things that I like about Indian Abyss. But I still have a few on my shelf of shame that I hope to explore in the future, and I think there is 2 on the top of the list, and that's Pendragon and Fire in the Lake that I only played, never a full game, only just a few campaigns. I never really had the opportunity to play it fully, and I feel very ashamed. But I'm also here to make people feel okay with saying I haven't played Fire in the Lake yet. And Pendragon has been very high on my list for a while now, and I know that Morgane is going to complain again that I haven't played her game, but soon I will get to it. And that's it for me.
Yeah, Fred commented, just for those who aren't familiar with the whole Irregular Conflict series, I guess I'll do a brief intro to that before I move to Saverio, who also has a Irregular Conflict series game. That series is a spin-off of the Coin series, using Coin series mechanics coupled to increasingly divergent models. So one of the things that Volko called out was the presence of mechanics that enabled certain types of interactions. Those interactions speak to irregular conflict broadly. The idea of many factions, literalizing the division between those factions, having an event card that is played by all players instead of hand management. But I think that as we move forward, we're starting to get into conflicts where the core Coin series model doesn't mean as much. What is control if you're talking about medieval India? What is support and opposition if you're talking about civic politics? And so there's places where these topics are ripe for gaming using the asymmetric mechanics that come from the Coin series, and we wanted to create a home for those that didn't spin too far away from what the Coin series is trying to do. Of Robin fits in the GMT catalog. So now that I've said all that, Sav, tell us a little bit about your game, Vijayanagara, and what you're doing there, and then tell us a little bit about your intro to the Coin series.
Yeah, I'm Saverio Spagnolie. I'm one of the designers, along with Matthew Johnson, Corey Graham, and Aman Matthews, and developer Joe Dewhurst of Vijayanagara, which explores the collapse of the Delhi Sultanate and the rise of the Bahmani Kingdom and Vijayanagara Empire as the curtain is drawn up from the Deccan Empire in India. And this takes place over essentially a century in the 14th century. I'm a relative newcomer to this kind of game. The first one I tried was Cuba Libre. I was drawn to that because my father-in-law is Cuban, and he fled with his family from Havana when he was 8 years old during this particular conflict. And I just wanted to learn a bit more about the history in this interactive medium, which offers some really unique features. In particular, just the fact that there is a model and that you can explore it. The fact that the narratives that emerged are not forced, that they just kind of come out of the model itself. And I just really like modeling. I really like simulations. I think a lot about these things in an entirely different context from my day-to-day life. But I also really like strategic games, and I like having fun. So that really checked all the boxes. And as Volko was saying, the overlapping incentives, I think, was something that I found very, very intriguing. Most recently, I've been poking at A Falling Sky about Caesar's adventures in Gaul in 50 BC or so. And I think that's the kind of escapism that maybe I've wanted in the last year and a half or so, which is not only an adventure in space, but also in time.
Yeah, and it's probably worth mentioning that your game came out of a prototype that was built for the Constant Game Jam last year at basically the height of the pandemic. We did an online game jam, and you and three others, you have three co-designers, put together this game in a prototype form for that, and then polished it up and got it ready as a product. So that's right.
That was a great COVID diversion that was organized by Fred here and Joe and Sean O'Keefe, and I can say more about that maybe in a little bit. But yeah, that was
and just
no relief from COVID there.
One thing to note, if people want to see a bit more about the game and see how it looks like, there was an interview a couple of months back on the channel with the other designers that is actually running through the historical context of the game and a bit of the gameplay. So if you want to see more about what Vijayanagara is about and what it looks like, I definitely recommend to go and check that out.
Yeah. And then let's talk to Joe Dewhurst. Joe is the designer of the Pure Land. Joe, tell us a little bit about your game and your intro to the Coin series.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, my game, The Pure Land, will be, I think, volume 14 of the Coin series, and it depicts a civil war in 15th century Japan between two coalitions of clans, but also social and economic disturbances. I guess a few years ago. Oh, is it bad?
You're back.
Yeah,
I'm back. Great. Sorry, I have a very bad internet connection in Germany. Despite being a very modern nation in many ways, has got terrible internet infrastructure. Sorry. So I got into Coin a few years ago and kind of got into it all at once, exploring all of the games at once, just reading all the rules, consuming everything. Like Saverio, and I think for similar reasons, I'm particularly drawn to the kind of modeling aspect of it and the way Volko approaches this in a very kind of purposeful manner. And what I really enjoy, I think, is two things Volko mentioned. So the very asymmetric factions, both in terms of aims and methods, and how the interactions between these different asymmetries produces, very interesting and novel kinds of situations. So it's this idea of modeling a complex system, I think, which is something I look at in other situations. I find really fascinating in how to depict that in a board game.
Yeah. I think that's great.
I would say so. In terms of my top volumes, Fire and the Lake I think is just absolute peak classic Coin. Can't beat it. Absolutely fantastic. At the other end of the spectrum, perhaps I really enjoy Pendragon, and I think it just really demonstrates how flexible the core systems are and what you can do with them. So that's one other I find very fascinating.
Yeah, and Joe, you did a video on this channel as well, going through your game in detail, right?
I did, yeah. And just for someone in the chat who maybe missed me during my German timeout there, the game is about a civil war in 15th century Japan between two coalitions during the decline of the shogunate of that period. But also not just the civil war, but also the kind of social and political unrest in the countryside that was going on at the same time. Okay.
Yeah. That's one of the great things about Coin is you can cover the economic, the political, the military, all kind of in the same board, which is awesome. So what I would love to do is hear a little bit more about why you decided to design a game on your topic. And then, Fred and Saverio, your games are in the Irregular Conflict series. Joe, your game is a Coin game. Tell me a little bit about why you feel that your game fits where it does, and kind of putting you on the spot with that a little bit for sure. But Fred, why don't we start with you? Why did you design it? Why Robin Hood, and why the Irregular Conflict series?
Yeah, sure. I think why Robin Hood is probably going back to the main reason of why I play board games. And I play board games to spend time with people I love most of the time. So that's what I prefer in gaming. Even if sometimes I have to play with Joe for work, most of the time I try to play with people I really like. And the thing with the Coin series is that I love it. I want to share it with as many people as possible. And it is not an easy game to get into. They are complex, they are pretty long, and the topics can be quite tough. And I was thinking about it during COVID last year, and I was wondering how could I approach making a game like this so I could spread the love that I have for that system to a wider audience. And it all started from a book that I have here by David Hobsbawm called Bandits. And there was in there a reference about an article from the 50s from an historian called Rodney Hilton, and that described what Robin Hood was doing as basically guerrilla warfare in the medieval era. And I read that article and it inspired me a lot. And that book also inspired me a lot about how banditry at a certain scale is actually pretty close to what would be political guerrilla warfare at a bigger scale. And I thought, well, here is an opportunity for me to make a game that tackles a few issues that I see in getting more people into the series, which is tackling the footprint issue. And for me, the footprint is the cognitive load, the time that it takes to play a game, and the space that it takes on the table. And then the other major barrier of entry, which is usually the topics. Everyone knows about Robin Hood. It has this folktale aspect to it that is a bit less threatening, and everyone knows the story, and it's pretty positive and makes it really family friendly. But if you look into what it actually means, what they're actually depicting, it fits really well with this idea of showing complex social interaction, political interaction, but also direct conflict between different factions that have different means and different goals. And for me, that felt like the perfect fit and the perfect way for getting a new kind of audience within the series. But that meant that I had to change the system quite a bit, and I had to make the narrative aspect way stronger than the purely mechanical one. And I think for me that is probably why it fits better into the ICS part of the portfolio for GMT, because it is a bit less historical. It dabs into, at the same time, history, but also folktales. It is a bit easier access, a bit more narrative. So it is not necessarily a pure concept in any way, and it's not its purpose. So for me, that made a lot of sense to have it here, and it is a bit irregular compared to the classical coin system. And I think it fits really well there. I wouldn't have seen it as a pure coin volume anyway. And I'm actually really happy that we expanded to open up to different kinds of approaches to the system.
Yeah. Now, Fred, one of the things that your game does to literalize that kind of narrative is the physical coins, right?
Yes.
And the banditry is actually interacting with those. I thought that was a cool way to literalize that narrative and to speak to that kind of difference in the model between those two.
So do you want me to build upon that, or do you want to?
No, I'll come back to you on that. I just
Okay,
want to just drop that in there. Saverio, tell us a little bit. Same question for you. Why medieval India, and what makes it an ICS game?
Well, as you were saying a couple minutes ago, the project kind of emerged from out of essentially thin air during that weekend, that Consim Game Jam, and the challenge in that weekend was to recycle a previous volume in the coin series. And I just happened to have Bruce Mansfield's very excellent Gandhi sitting out on the table with this gorgeous map, which was developed by our esteemed interviewer here. And I just started digging back through Indian history to see if something might work. But then it just felt like just kind of hitting on gold, finding this period of history in the 14th century with the Vijayanagara Empire, which at its height was the second largest city in the world behind Beijing. But I could kind of see already very quickly the big bones of a model that might work there, and it just was an entirely unexplored part of history for us. But it was very appealing, just in the narrative arc and the epic nature of that century. And we just figured that other people might be excited about it, like we were in the beginning. After that initial sprint, of course, then it became a serious project, and it never would have become a real polished game if it hadn't been for some really fantastic co-designers. I have a hard time wrapping my mind around just how many hours I spent with Matthew in particular in the last year, who, among other aspects of the game design, is responsible for the very nice map and a lot of the artwork in the game, which you may or may not have come across yet online. We've had a long series of discussions with a historical consultant, Aparna Kapadia, who's an associate professor at Williams College studying South Asian history. And those interactions in particular really helped to, we wanted to make sure to get the history right. And that's been very helpful, of course, along that path. But we also wanted to make sure that we understood a little bit better about how the game is going to be engaged with by people now, in the current, the present climate. Back to the question about coin versus ICS, and this has been talked about. Volko started to go down this path a bit earlier, but we've started to move a little bit away from some of the ideas that are more relevant to more modern conflicts, counterinsurgency modeling, and in particular things like population support or opposition as a kind of a center of gravity. I think Volko was saying it doesn't quite apply as conveniently in kind of medieval modeling of kingdoms and tributary relationships. And so that's where our abstraction took us, was to basically a simpler relationship between regions and kind of its political dynamics. And so it starts to move away from that fundamental coin model. I think this will probably be discussed, but other maybe future games I'll probably start to even dip even further away, which I'm very excited about. But regardless, I think one of the most exciting things about the development of the game has been that hardcore coin players have really enjoyed the game, but people who have never played a coin game before have really enjoyed the game. So
yeah. I think your game is a great example of taking some of the mechanics from the coin series and tweaking the model a little bit and coming up with something that feels very different while still playing mechanically similarly. So that's my favorite part about it, is I don't have to learn a whole bunch of new rules, but I get a completely different experience, which is great.
We're absolutely standing on the shoulders of the giants before in the area, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And Joe, tell us a little bit about your decision. Why the Onin War, and what makes it coin in your mind?
Yeah, thank you. So I was actually originally interested particularly in the Iko-Iki, who were a militant Buddhist sect, who were particularly at the height of their power actually in the century after, so in the 16th century. But they, during that period, the kind of better known Sengoku Jidai period, were more of a conventional military force, with their own armies and so on. So I began looking back into their early origins during the 15th century and during the Onin War. And at this time, they had just been chased out of Kyoto by rival sects and traveled into the countryside, where they, dispersed and were persecuted and tried to spread their faith. And this started to feel really like a good candidate for a coin type faction. So I then looked into this period more, and there's this civil war going on at the same time between two coalitions of clans, devastating the countryside and causing unrest. And then this also prompted peasant revolts, unconnected to the Iko-Iki. So there's another good aspect there. So this really seemed like a strong candidate for a kind of coin style conflict, even though it's obviously an earlier period. So that was the journey that got me there, and then I had to do a lot of research. And it's a fairly obscure period, I would say. So there's one book published in the 1950s called The Onin War. I have it next to me, but I won't show it to you because it'll be too blurry anyway. And that's really the main English text focusing on the war. So I had to track down a copy of that, which was a little tricky. The good news is there's actually a short volume coming out by Turnbull this month, I believe, being released on the Onin War, which is more of a military history. He's done a lot of these Osprey guides. So that's actually something I can definitely recommend to read alongside the game, just to give you a kind of general sense of the war itself. So I did a lot of research into that. Why is it good for coin rather than ICS? So I think bouncing off something Saverio said here is nice. So this period in Japan I would describe as on the cusp of like truly medieval and more early modern. And this is reflected in the game where there is something more like a political conscience emerging among the general population. So one of the core dynamics here is support for the shogunate, which is very weak at this point. So it didn't really have any power of its own, but still governed. And then opposition to that. So that's a kind of a core coin dynamic between rural opposition or support for the government in Kyoto, with the twist that there are two factions actually cooperating on trying to maintain this support while fighting each other to control the government. So there's a kind of an internal civil war going on there. But if they lose support of the populace, then in history. So by the end of the civil war, the capital was in ruins and the countryside was devastated, and no one supported the government anymore. So winning that war no longer mattered, and that's how it ended. And that what to me makes it seem more like a good coin candidate rather than ICS.
Yeah, absolutely. I love exploring that idea of the development of a political conscience within the framework of a game system that assumes its presence. There's some really interesting dynamics at play there. Again, Gene would fire me if I did not mention that all of these games are available on P500 right now.
And be careful because he's in the chat.
I know.
He's actually controlling that you're saying that. Yes. So
he's pulling the strings. I'm getting text messages. All right, let's go to the next question for you all. Fred, tell me about the factions in your game and what do they represent historically, and tell me a little bit about what the expected interactions are between those factions. Like Volko said, one of the beauties of coin is the literalization of some of the political realizations about a conflict in the faction dynamics. Your game is 2-player. which means that we should expect to see, I think, a little bit simpler network of interactions. But I'd still love to hear your thoughts here.
Yes, so it's only two factions are represented in the game. On one hand, you have the sheriff and his henchmen, and on the other, you have Robin Hood and his merrymen. So it's two archetypical faction, with one being a classic insurgent and the other being a classic counter-insurgent. But they have very different objectives, and maybe also you could say different objectives compared to what you would see in other coin games. The sheriff is mostly trying to maintain control of the Nottinghamshire for pure tax reasons. He's trying to extract as much wealth as he can from the peasantry without having a massive revolt on his hands. So he's really trying to have a balancing act here of generating as much wealth as he can and generating as much legitimacy and control over the territory. Whereas on the other side, you have Robin Hood that is trying to tap into the increased anger of the peasantry to actually attack the legitimacy of the sheriff. What is interesting here is that what he's trying to do is not attack the legitimacy of the state itself, but the legitimacy of the sheriff only, because in the end, he just wants to make sure that he's still Robin Hood as a figure, but also in the game is still legitimate to the crown and expects King Richard to come back. So he's just trying to hurt as much the sheriff's legitimacy when he comes back and potentially present himself as an alternative. So it's quite of a bit of a weird system in that way. And the way they actually act with each other is that they're going to score points in different ways. The sheriff is going to score points by each time he managed to extract wealth from the peasantry and have carriages coming into Nottingham and accumulating that wealth and that show of power, whereas Robin Hood is either going to score points by inspiring the people or potentially also by instigating revolt, especially at key moments where there are going to be royal inspections. So you're going to have representative of the king that are going to come to the Shire and check, okay, what's the state of Nottingham right now, and see how much the legitimacy of the sheriff is impacted.
Cool. Yeah. Saverio, tell us about the factions in Vijayanagara and what kind of interactions they have.
Vijayanagara is a 3-player game, and the playable factions are the Delhi Sultanate, the Bahmani Kingdom, and the Vijayanagara Empire. There's a 4th non-playable faction, Mongol invaders rumbling in the mountains to the northwest of Delhi, which are operated at different times in the game by the Bahmani and Vijayanagara players. One of the main design goals that we have always had in the development of the game has been to motivate player actions, not just strategically, but emotionally. So for instance, we didn't want to force the Delhi Sultanate player to do the historical thing and reach into the south to demand tribute from smaller kingdoms to win points or something. Instead, we wanted the Delhi Sultanate player to feel the pressure of the impending Mongol invasions and the desperation for resources in order to defend itself, which might motivate it to reach into the south to demand tribute from smaller kingdoms. We wanted the Bahmani Kingdom to feel the irritation of oppressive taxation from the Delhi Sultanate and its geographic proximity, leading it to have to be very careful if it's going to try to break away. So it needs to make sure that it is strong enough and economically sound enough to be able to make that kind of move. But that in turn incentivizes them to build up their kind of quietly build up their trade network, build up some cavalry, to conspire with the governors of Delhi. And it's a bit of a timing, of when is it time? When are you strong enough to make a complete break? And then in the case of Vijayanagara Empire, the 3rd faction in the game, which is also desperate to emerge out from under Delhi's oppressive thumb. How do you do that? Well, you have to lean on your strengths, and in that case, Vijayanagara wants to exploit its huge, vibrant population. It wants to construct temple towns to kind of enhance its commercial activity, to rally the elite warriors of recently fallen kingdoms, the Nayakas, so that ultimately, when Delhi's just weak enough, Vijayanagara can rebel as well. And some of the emergent relationships that come out of those incentives are uneasy alliances, which can form for what amounts in the game to maybe decades. And so as an example, if the Bahmani Kingdom and Vijayanagara Empire, these kind of upstart nascent kingdoms, their entities, if they start bothering each other a little too early in history, then of course it's going to be the third faction. It's the Delhi Sultanate, which is going to benefit the most. And what I think there's just kind of something very nice about 3-player games where those kind of the merging of the temporary alignments and divergences, how they play out. And in particular, there's something kind of almost rhythmic and cyclical about it with a 3-player game that you enjoy.
Yeah, and you are leveraging the sequence of play from Ken T's People Power. Is that right?
Absolutely, that's right. Yeah,
so that contributes to that rhythm and cadence that the 3 factions have in the way that they interact, which is really cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Joe, tell us a little bit about the Pure Land and what you're doing with your factions there, what they represent historically, and what kind of interactions players should expect.
So it's a 4-player game using the kind of classic coin system for that. On the one hand, you've got these two powerful clans, Hosokawa and Yamana, who are the two kind of leading families at the time, and they're fighting this civil war to control the shogunate. So they want to basically be appointed the power behind the throne to control the shogunate. And in a break actually from some of what we were saying earlier, they have fairly symmetrical action menus to represent that they're really the same kinds of powers, but they have quite different ways of achieving this goal. So the Hosokawa are kind of a more well-established in the court, so they're aiming for clan support from other clans. So they're aiming a kind of more political takeover, whereas the Yamana are kind of upstarts. They've been suppressed recently, having rebelled against the previous shogun. So they're going for territorial control. So they just want to build up a big army and control enough land. So they're fighting each other for the same objective, but have different ways of achieving this using similar kinds of tools. But at the same time, both of them need to make sure not to devastate the population too much, or else they'll, there isn't going to be any government worth controlling. So opposing them here are firstly the Ikuiki, who I mentioned earlier. So this militant order of Buddhist monks and lay people. They have quite an esoteric faith, which I write more about in an Inside GMT article about this. And their aim is to spread this faith. So rather than performing terror attacks like a more conventional insurgent faction, they preach to place these Nembutsu tokens down, representing one particular key aspect of their faith, and spread these around the land. And these become very irritating for other factions because they allow them to take resources from a 4th faction, which I'll get to in a moment, and convert soldiers to their side and things like this. And they become very hard to dislodge once they've put those down. So even if you stamp them out, they'll pop back up again quite easily. But they begin very weak at the beginning of the game, having just fled into the countryside. So they're trying to do this, but they're also trying to build opposition to the shogunate, because part of their faith is this idea that whether or not you reach enlightenment doesn't come from your own personal actions. So not paying taxes and fighting against the government doesn't mean anything. So they're doing that and trying to fight the government there. The 4th faction I hinted at there are called the G Samurai, and they represent a kind of loose coalition of richer peasants, merchants, so there's a kind of emerging mercantile class, and some of the poorer nobles who are left out of the kind of big power politics, and they're what you might call a kind of classic coin green faction. So they just really want to be left alone and make money, trade and make money. But one of their main ways of doing this is using there's a kind of a 5th faction piece, which are the peasants, and these are not directly controlled by anyone, but they're a kind of a resource which everyone uses. So you use them to get money from the G Samurai, and you use them in peasant revolts to disrupt control, which can be led by both the G Samurai and the Ikuiki. And they're also conscripted into troops for the first 2 factions. So one of the core dynamics here is about the different ways that these peasant pieces are used by all the factions. And this is something I really wanted to do, is to give more of a kind of direct representation of the common people being used in these different ways in this conflict, who are really badly affected by it.
Yeah, I really personally appreciate the way that the different classes in society are represented in the game, along with clan loyalty. I think those are really interesting new ideas to bring into the coin series. So the last question for you all is a design question, which are always fun. Tell me a little bit about the biggest challenge in your design and what you did to the design for that. So Fred, I think we'll start with you. I have a sneaking suspicion that you're gonna talk about Ludo narrative, but let's see where this goes.
Yeah, I think it's one of them. The first challenge is, and it was the case for my previous game, is when you have a 2-player short, very dense game, you have quite a big challenge around balance. That's one of the things that is really tough, because you don't have a lot of time to actually fix the balance during a short gameplay. So you have to make it fit, and if you still want to have a narrative of up and down and one player feeling like he's the underdog and building up, it's and making this fit within 1 hour playtime and keep it balanced, it can be quite challenging. So that was probably the first thing that was quite hard and that we've worked a lot on. And I would just like to maybe just a shout out to all the people that took part in the Gest of Robin Hood tournament earlier this year, that helped a massive amount in actually fixing all those balance issues. That was great to have that many plays, and especially repeated plays, and each of them being higher and higher levels. So that was super useful. So the first thing was balance, but that's not an exciting thing to talk about. I think the other challenge that was probably a bit more fun is how do you bring some of the narrative from Robin Hood into a game that is into a system that is supposed to be an abstract model of complex social, economical, and sometimes military interactions. And I think that was one of the interesting challenges, to not break the system and benefit from its strength, but also bring that folktale element and feel like, well, when you're playing the Robin Hood faction, when you're playing Robin Hood, you feel like you're actually encountering travelers, that you're meeting with people, that you're confronted to situations that feel like a bit that folktale. So getting that narrative coming in. And that was one of the challenges that I had, because I wanted people to feel like they were playing tricks on the sheriff, or that the sheriff was trying to do something to Robin Hood. Like, I wanted this to come, like the sheriff could actually find a powerful ally and do something and burn a camp. And like, I wanted them to really feel like they were living that story and not just playing an abstraction in a short time, still with a system that can be that abstracts a lot of things. And one of the ways I did that is by introducing the Traveler's deck. That is a completely different mechanic that doesn't exist in any other con game. And that's the idea that Robin Hood is going to encounter travelers when he's going to do his robbing actions. And you don't know who he's going to meet. Some of them are pretty generic, monks, merchants, knights that are just there. But some of them are going to be directly linked to the actual folktales, to the actual stories of Robin Hood. And then the 2-player sequence of play enables also to make the event way more powerful and more central to the game. And that was also one of the ways that we could do that. And from this, I benefited from Steven's work, Steven Ronganzas, that actually has also in P500, The British Way, that is also a series of 4 2-player coin game about British colonialism. And he introduced that new sequence of play for 2-player that is a bit faster and simpler, and gives more importance to the event, which for me was key, as I wanted the narrative to be stronger. So really thinking about making sure that the event brings that story, that Robin Hood feeling into it was key. So making events more important, but also finding new ways to introduce some narrative elements and feel like you're really living this Robin Hood story. That was probably the biggest challenge, and one of the things I'm the proudest of about the game.
That's awesome, Fred. I love your shout out to Steven's British Way pack. Volko mentioned earlier, if you took all of the conflicts covered in wargaming and you mapped them out, they would just be dots all over the map. There's these big areas that aren't covered, and Steven is filling in the map a little bit for us, I think, with some of those conflicts that are in the British Way. And we'll talk about that, I think, here in a minute. Sav, tell me about the biggest challenge you all faced with Vijayanagara.
Well, I was going to say it if Fred didn't, but I think the Traveler deck really makes it all work out really nicely in terms of blending the narrative and technical challenges over in Gest. I think that was really done very well. And we had more or less a similar type of balancing act to try to achieve. That was, I'd say, the principal challenge for us, which is, I talked before about mirroring the historical faction motivations with the kind of player's emotional experience while playing the game. But that goal has to play nicely with the other main goal of streamlining. So, how do we get unique player investment into the factions while still keeping the game under 2 hours, making sure you don't have to go back to the rule book, making sure it's something that you can experience more or less fully on the first playthrough, even if the deeper strategies might not emerge until after multiple plays. So essentially, this amounts to a balancing act between the technical challenges and the storytelling challenges. And I think since we've been chasing that since day one, we've managed to pull it off. We're really happy with it. I'd say there have been probably 10 times in the last year where we thought we came into what felt like major challenges or problems or hurdles, but we've found creative ways over them each time. One hurdle related to somewhat stale board states which were emerging. We dealt with that by kind of starting fresh and redesigning a new combat system which satisfied a number of the requirements that we kind of imposed upon it. One was to find a non-violent way for factions to enhance their influence in different regions. Since these factions all had complex, multi-dimensional relationships, even if there were some major battles between them historically, they were also engaged in multiple mutually beneficial interactions. It's over a course of a century. Another problem relating to some gaminess during the endgame was solved by modifying Timur's final invasion of Delhi, which in 1398 comes in and ends the game for us. And there was just a little bit of gaminess which was entering in, taking you out of the narrative experience. But Matthew's famous double Timur solution, which he was raving about for months before we finally implemented it, is fantastic. So that worked out great. Corey and Joe have been working on a card-driven solo design system like the ones in Gandhi and Fire in the Lake. I expect that has also hit on a number of snags and solutions since they seem to be pretty happy with where that's at. I'll just say it's astonishing the number of small items that can manage to throw things into total disarray. But the fact that somehow the game has not exploded speaks to kind of the strength of the bones of the base model, which seem to be pretty solid. And that in large part just goes back to the robustness and strength of the models in Volko's original Coin Series games.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it does speak to the importance of development. And so you have a Joe developing your game, which is a great help, I'm sure. So Joe, let's talk. Joe, let's talk about Pure Land. So in contrast to these other two games, the Pure Land is not an intro game. It is not something that casual Coin Series players are likely going to want to use as a starting point. Tell me a little bit about the design challenges you ran into doing a more in-depth treatment.
Okay. So the first one I'll mention was I had to model somehow these quite complex clan dynamics without overdoing it, because you could do a whole game about this using many kind of different kinds of systems. And this is of primary interest just to the two more conventional factions anyway, so I didn't want it to completely overtake the game. And what I went for in the end is a system that I describe as a kind of political geography, which I think actually is something Volko just said earlier, in fact, where rather than being conventional geographical regions like mountains or jungles or whatever, each region is governed by one of these other clans, kind of non-player clans, and then these are competed over for loyalty by the two conventional clan factions, and this allows them to do things in those regions. So this introduces kind of a whole extra dynamic there, which every faction has some interest in, without completely overwhelming the game. I do think it's still one of the more complex aspects of the game, but once you've become familiar with it, it's really not too difficult. And then I think the complexity does lower quite a lot, and it's maybe more like a mid complexity rather than high complexity coin once you've got your head around this one bit. The second challenge I had was with actually the Iko-Iki faction, who for a long time, despite being where I started from, really just played like any other typical insurgent faction, like the Viet Cong in 15th century Japan. So they would take preach actions rather than terror, but these would still just shift towards opposition. And that didn't really feel very interesting or very accurate. So I spent a long time actually discussing this with Steven Rangazas, who's been mentioned once already, who's my developer, or one of my two developers for this game. And Steven's actually an expert in 20th century counterinsurgency, but was very helpful for thinking about what differences there could be with one of these older proto-insurgencies. And I think we came up with a really good system for modeling something less like a violent political insurgency and more like a underground religious movement, where, as I mentioned earlier, when they preach, they remove support for the government because people are drawn to this strange esoteric faith instead, rather than the conventional Buddhist hierarchy. And they put down these tokens representing that there's some portion of faithful community here, and those become very hard to dislodge because you have a choice either of violently taking out the monks in that area or suppressing the faith. But if you do the former, then more people will just spring up again, which is a common feature of modern insurgencies too, I would say, but in quite a tough way. When it's a religious insurgency, that goes deep, and people are quite committed to this. So that's how in the end that's what we got to, and it feels quite different and becomes a core part of their gameplay. So they have quite a slow beginning and are quite slow to spread, but if you let that get out of control, by the end of the game they become very hard to stop, because so much of the country now believes in their faith. And actually this faith, Jodo Shinshu, or True Pure Land Buddhism, is where the name of the game comes from, and also actually I should say is now probably the largest Buddhist sect in modern Japan. So from these quite humble origins, they've now become huge. And I think this speaks to the power of faith in these kinds of conflicts.
Absolutely. So speaking of challenges, Volko, let's turn our attention to things that are nearer in the future. Fall of Saigon, the expansion to Fire in the Lake, is basically done. We're just editing some booklets at this point. Do you want to say anything about the challenges that we had there and kind of what's going on with that game?
So the original stimulus for that expansion, not the first expansion we have in the coin series, but the original inspiration was Mark wanting to cover the part of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam that we had left out, that after 1972, because after that it's not a four-party insurgency, counterinsurgency anymore. It's a, guerrilla warfare definitely still going on, but a focus on the conventional two-way conventional contest between the North and the South, the ARVN and the NVA. And then when we said, okay, we're going to do that, we said, well, that can be a standalone two-player game, and we already have Brian Train's Colonial Twilight two-player coin sequence of play to adapt. That was an easy solution. The harder part, I think, was, and so anyway, what I thought was going to be hard. What I thought was going to be hard was realizing, mechanized conventional warfare in the coin series system. That turned out to work, I guess, pretty well. I mean, it involved a lot of tuning, of course, by you and the playtest teams. But it wasn't the larger hurdle, I think, was what we thought players would expect, and that is, this is not just a two-player game on 73-75, but links to the original, so that you could play the whole U.S. phase 1964 to 1975, and have scenarios for that, which we did, but to then go from imagine what the rules of the show are, how things work in 1964, and then how things work in 1973, 4 and 5. The rules of the system changed. So we've got a transformational, which is the reason we didn't do that in the original Fire in the Lake. So that meant Mark coming up with Paris piece mechanics that make the first part of that would be a very long game interesting for the end phase, and also be historical. So there's a lot of then counterfactual outcomes that go into what 1973 to 75 looks like if you've been playing earlier parts of it.
Yeah.
But it can't be too counterfactual. And I think to devise and tune all of that seemed to be what took up a lot of the wavelength.
Yeah. I mean, I could speak a little bit to that. I was the developer along with Joe and Steven for this game. There were 4 of us. There's also a solitaire developer. So you got spoiled, Volko. You got
big team effort here. Yeah. No, true truth.
But I think with the Tet offensive and kind of the demolition of the VC cadre in the South, there's not as much of a divide anymore between the NVA and VC leadership. The NVA just sort of swarms in and subsumes whatever is left of the VC after 68, and the premise of the original Fire in the Lake game becomes a lot harder to maintain through those last 7 years of the conflict. And so coming up with plausible ways to model that. What if the VC had rebuilt their leadership? What would that look like? What would their operational tempo look like? And at some point, someone, I don't even remember who it was, came up with the idea to make VC actions cost 2 resources instead of 1 to slow their tempo. And it really was probably the most elegant solution to an incredibly difficult problem, to model friction between this hypothetical reborn VC and NVA without it overwhelming the mechanical warfare aspects of the game, which are so important to the narrative, as Volko mentioned. So really looking forward to getting that into people's hands, and it should be wrapped up and getting out to the printer here not too far in the future. So so thank you to the panel. Really appreciate all of your time and your thoughtful responses. I wanted to very briefly just go over kind of what's next. What should you expect on your table from the Coin series here in the next 2 years? So for starters, we mentioned Fall of Saigon. Very excited about that game. And for my money, Black April is my favorite. The 2-player scenario is my favorite Coin experience, full stop. So I really enjoy that. After that, Ken T's People Power is also in the final stages of development. Joe has been assisting with that as well, getting some solitaire bots put together, using the cards that we used for Gandhi and Fire in the Lake. And that game is a lot of fun. 3 players covering the 1981 to 1986 period in the Philippines, the fall of the Marcos dictatorship, the installation of Corazon Aquino as the president of the Philippines. There's a lot going on there. Really interesting. Draws from Gandhi and has a lot of nonviolent, but political, mass nonviolent, that are really based on political movements rather than civil resistance, which is really great. After that, Brian Train's China's War. Somebody asked about this earlier. That game is about to spin up development. So we've been doing some design feedback for Brian and kind of building out all the things that need to happen to get playtesting started. So in order for us to play test, not only do we have to kind of have the materials ready to go and have a tabletop simulator or Vassal module ready so that people can play online, especially necessary right now. But we also need to know what questions we want answered by the playtesters. It's not enough to simply hand a game to someone and say, play this, is it good? We need to have crafted questions to be able to say, well, what narrative are you experiencing? Where is the narrative friction? What are the rough spots of the rules? And asking those good questions is a key part of game development. And so we're in the process of kind of building out that list of questions, but we don't anticipate too much longer before we're going to open up playtesting for that one. And then the next game would be Jay Carmichael's Red Dust Rebellion, which is a fictional insurgency set on Mars in the not too distant future. That game has been a lot of fun to see go in art, and the illustrations from Marcos are just incredible. Lots of fun. That game is also just really progressing well. It is in playtesting, and as far as I know, that's gone very well. There's some really interesting mechanical changes in that game with the Church of the Reclaimer faction not participating in they have their own method of kind of determining when and how to act and how many resources they have to do that. And it's been a ton of fun to play around with different mechanics within the Coin series. Beyond that, so Joe's coin game, the Pure Land, is the volume after that one. So that kind of wraps up what's on P500 right now. What else is coming?
And the British Way.
The British Way.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yes. So that's the mainline Coin series. There's a Coin multi-pack series that we just created. So the first game in that Coin multi-pack series is the British Way from Stephen Rangazis, and that game is a 4-pack of 2-player games with all different British counterinsurgencies. They play, Joe, how long? What's the average playtime on those? They're shorter, right?
Yeah, under an hour easily. I mean, me and Stephen play them in 20 minutes, but we're weirdos. I would say certainly, an hour and a half first time, under an hour once you've learned the system.
Yeah.
And Stephen has hinted that he intends to continue with some more multi-packs with the smaller games. Is that correct?
Yeah, he has a lot of ideas. I think you've seen his document of his fret of what he might design if you let him. There's a lot.
So very exciting stuff there. And a lot more to look forward to. And then on the Irregular Conflict Series side, without stealing Gene's thunder, because I don't want to do that, I'll just say stay tuned for an announcement there. Volume 3 coming soon to a newsletter near you. So some exciting things to look at there, going in a completely different direction, very different than what we've seen before. So with that, that's the end of the panel discussion. I'd love to answer some questions from the chat and
and there are a few questions here, so I'm gonna bring them up. And Lee here had a two-part question, and I think it's probably more for the coin part of the panel, so the serious people. The first part of the question is, what would be your thought about designing a coin game that covers contemporary or near contemporary conflicts? Which is interesting because there are already quite a few. There are a few of those. I mean, Distant Plain is pretty near, but that's probably a question for Volko or maybe even you, Jason, or.
Yeah. Well, you've done this twice. You've designed 2 games on current conflicts. Do you want to take a stab at this?
Sure. And I don't know which 2 you're counting. Labyrinth, War and Terror outside the coin series did that in a way, and in Abyss. That story certainly was not over at the time that I designed that. Although the denouement was, I guess, in process. And then a Distant Plain on Afghanistan. And I think, there are a couple of issues there that one needs to look at. If you're designing something on a conflict that's, underway or very recent, people who fought or are fighting are living people, that does put in especially sharp burden on you to, be respectful in that presentation, right? That the fun, because these games are for fun, the fun that we're trying to deliver with this gameplay experience is that of gaining understanding, of exploration, of representation as best as the design, development, test, and production team can of what we think is going on there, because we're interested in learning, right? And that's the main kind of fun we at least aim for. Well, for whatever reason you buy it, you play it, you can have fun any way you like. It's your it's your item now, but that's what I think we have to try to deliver, rather than fun from either celebrating or denigrating or doing something that is based in value judgments. Okay, so that's one. Then immediately you have to say, well, wait a minute, aren't the value judgments going to be in there? Because since we're all, we were alive and thinking and consuming news about, and in some cases participating in these affairs, of course we have views, which means we have biases, and we want to be conscious of those. If we're trying to do the best we can to present, here's how things work, we have to say, well, what are my particular lenses that affect that? And that's, something that, again, we have to be sharper in our reflection on that if it's a recent topic. But then, that isn't a matter of degree. We have to be sharper, because for all of history, we have biases. I have biases about Caesar and Gaul. I think Fred does too. They might be different, right? And those are going to be in my design as well. And in fact, that's in a way a feature, not a bug of history, because that's what we pay historians for. They interpret things because we always have gaps in information. One of the questions in the chat was, well, what if it's a recent conflict and we don't yet have the information? What if you're doing ancient conflict or medieval conflict? You have huge gaps in the information, right? They're never going to be filled. And if you design a game, a model, for it to work, you got to fill some things in from your speculation, reasoning, guesswork, interpretation, hunch, intuition, whatever. That's what historians do, and that's what historical game designers inevitably have to do. It's just that maybe if it happened 2,000 years ago, people aren't as personally involved, and therefore may not be as much affected in a bad way that you'd like to avoid, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, passions can run high about Caesar and Gaul too, let me tell you, right? And I guess then finally, the final consideration is not to be too confident in our ability of our little model on the tabletop to predict anything. This is a temptation if you've got something that's still ongoing, there's still a future to that conflict. Well, here I'm going to try to show you how insurgency in Afghanistan worked. When I did that design with Brian in 2013, we tried to be very clear with ourselves and with our audience. We hope we succeeded. This is a history game. This is Afghanistan 2001 to 2013. It may help you understand how things are working, but we're not trying to say the way that your game goes tells you how this conflict's going to end. It doesn't.
Right.
And that's something I think I learned a little bit from experience. I think we were clearer about in A Distant Plain, which I did in 2012, 2013, than I had been either with myself or with my audience in Labyrinth, The War on Terror, which I designed in 2009, and clearly at a time when the global war on terror was still a thing.
Yeah. I think you touched on something really interesting, which is that as game designers, we decide what plausible outcomes are on the tabletop. And then we decide from that what means and ends we give the players to achieve those. And a lot of playtesting is looking at an end state and saying, is this plausible or not? And I think that in a contemporary conflict can be a particularly thorny way to approach it, because we don't necessarily know how the conflict is going to end. We only have a lens on one particular state. And that can lead to those assumptions that you were talking about taking hold.
Absolutely.
There is one thing that I would like to add, because listening to Volko, it made me think about something, and I don't really have that problem with my game, so I'm coming in from a different perspective. But there is a prototype currently that is gaining some traction on Discord server that is called a Fading Star about Somalia, and he's actually pretty close to the event that he's depicting in his game. That gives him the opportunity of doing something that rarely you are able to do as a game designer, which is actually talking to people that were involved in the conflict that he's depicting. And in a way, the fact that it is that close also enables you as a designer to interact with people that were there, that know what it meant. And when it comes to carrying on about the topic and rethinking about how you want to depict it as a game, it makes even more sense, because you can expose your work to people that were directly involved and get their direct reaction, which also, in a way, has quite a pretty interesting benefit.
Yeah, I think that does speak to the historian role, that in some ways a game designer occasionally puts that hat on and attempts to make an interpretive decision about what's going on. And that type of research can really enrich the design.
And just to bounce very quickly off of that with a very important implication, and that is about what the role is of the players in all this, right? If we understand that everything that in that model relies on interpretation by somebody, what you're getting when you play one of these games is somebody's or some group of somebody's model, okay, that you're comparing to your own, because when you sit down as a player, you already know something about the topic, most likely, if you're interested in doing it. Maybe it's a little, maybe it's a lot. You know certainly something about humanity and how humanity works, right? And so what I think we have to hope for as designers and developers is that if we're doing something on a consequential topic like a recent conflict, that's how players approach it. We're not presuming to tell you players exactly everything. We can't. We're going to give you an interpretation, a simplification, a model that we hope helps you think about it, but it's how you take that in and critique that and compare it to what you know about the real world that gives it its value.
Yeah. Well said. Fred, let's keep rolling.
I'm going to bring another question. A question here from Garrett around: do you see any room for the coin series to have games set at a city level, or do you see conflict at that scale being handled better by other systems?
So, this is a really interesting question. About a year ago, there was a pretty long discussion on the Coin Discord about whether we could use the coin series to model city-level conflicts in Iraq, like Fallujah, and what it would take to modify the system to do that. And I think the consensus was that it would be possible, But again, Volko spoke a little bit to one of the assumptions in the coin series being the gravity and the centrality of population to and population support to modeling these conflicts. And at a city level, that changes a little bit. No doubt, if you look at something like the Battle of Mogadishu, there was definitely areas that were held by one clan or another, or had allegiance to one faction or another, even within a city. And so there would be room to model something like that. But I think that would be a particular challenge of the system, and something that I would love to see somebody attempt to tackle. In that vein, I don't want to steal Gene's thunder, but I would pay attention to the newsletter coming up with the next Irregular Conflict Series game. It may have something to say about this topic.
But I think we can do a small shout out to Brian Train, that has a system that is dedicated to insurgency on an urban level.
Absolutely.
Called Civil Power. That is also an interesting system to approach it, I think. And Brian is pretty good with insurgency systems, I would say. So that's something also if you're interested to look at. And then I'm looking at other question. And Joe, if you think about something, let me know. Because there is one question that we already covered regarding the recency of the conflict, and I think that Volko's answer covers all of it. So I'm just looking through the other questions that we have, and we actually had another question from Lee that was not talking about recent conflicts, but I was actually talking about is coin adapted to more fictional settings. So alternatively, are fictional or non-historical games somehow less attractive for the coin series than historical games?
Well,
Could I say this? Oh, go ahead.
yeah, sure, go ahead.
I just have one thought on that. So I think Jared's done a great job with RDR, but one thing which does strike me is often really, real life is just stranger than fiction. And one of the things I really love about coin games is you learn about all these situations where lots of strange things happen, lots of strange circumstances which change the conflict. And if you don't have a well thought out background to your fiction, I think you can end up making something feel quite generic. Basically, you would have some insurgents, some cops, but without the particular key events which happened, like the different sects in South Vietnam or something like this. It's quite hard to get the strong narrative you get from real history, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a very good call out. And I think it speaks to Fred. Your game isn't even historical per se, just a Robin Hood, but it is legendary. And so to that regard, you have that rich narrative tradition to draw from. Thousands of Robin Hood stories that people have written from various different points of view over time to bolster that. I'm sorry, Volko, I think I cut you off. You had something you wanted to say.
Just to put in some additional ways, exactly what Joe said. My starting point as a game designer is, how does this world work? And I go from there to a game that shows you how this world works. Well, if this world is something that I just made up? This is not my time and talent spent making up worlds. If I take something that's a constructed, coherent world like Middle Earth, or a galactic empire facing a rebellion, or something like that, then I can do that. But the people who have invested the time and talent to do that, it's their property, right? And so now commercially, it becomes very expensive to do that. What Jared in Red Dust Rebellion has added to the mix that I could never do is he has created a coherent world in enough detail to do what Joe describes, and that is to give you intricate and interesting and complex gameplay to show you what that world is like. If we have a canon, a created fictional world, perhaps from medieval legend, say, that has that kind of detail, and we can afford to use because it's free or public or whatever, or we can somehow afford it, then I think all that works very well.
Yeah, and I will say, Jared has written more material that nobody will ever see than you could possibly imagine. That's the nature of doing a fictional game. Is it's 90% writing and 10% figuring out what parts of your writing are relevant. So Fred, do you have one more question for us, and then we can wrap up? I know we're basically at time.
Maybe two questions. One that is a bit more serious and one that is a bit more fun. And the last serious question is from NB, and he's asking about the Portuguese Angular game. And so just having a bit more context, and this will definitely be for Volko. And then if you can talk a bit about how Angola influenced the coin model.
So going back to my original plan for the series, I wanted to do 1 volume Modern Insurgency in Latin America, 1 Sub-Saharan Africa, 1 Middle East, 1 Southeast Asia. And before I could get around myself to any of those past Colombia, we went down different tracks because I had the opportunity to work with other designers to do that. I bought about $300 worth of books on Portuguese Angola. I was serious about going forward, but these other projects took over. I was attracted to that one because there were, again, multiple factions, 3 different guerrilla groups and the Portuguese counterinsurgents. So it seemed to fit well. I was thinking of, bringing in things like mining and railways and that sort of thing and sanctuary states and so forth. And it never came together. Briefly, there was a potential designer who was interested enough to pick up work on the project, but as so often happens, it did not go the route to playable prototype. So I still think it would be great to do. I'm a huge fan of Ragnar MMP Angola, which covers the first year of the civil war immediately after the Portuguese departure. And the story, that's sort of a prequel to that, would be a wonderful game to have in my collection. So I'm still hoping someday somebody does it.
Great, and I think we can have one last question to conclude the panel, and this one is also about design, but another angle at it, and that's does the panel listen to music when playing solo modes or solitaire board games? And I would extend it to also when we do design work, and what kind of music helps you all focus when playing?
Volko, why don't you go first?
I almost always listen to music, not just solo, not just design, but just when I'm playing games. I find that helps. I'm looking for tourism and time travel. I'm trying to be transported by games, and that's true of design as well. And so anything that helps me, and music helps me. So whatever music, to me, makes me think of that setting. It isn't always even necessarily the case. So if you're playing Romans, it's hard to find Roman music, for example, but there's some medieval music that, for whatever reason, in my mind, I connect with that setting, and so I play that. I've just been playing Star Wars Rebellion with my son Andrew. We listened to the Star Wars soundtrack. No surprise for me. Anything like that, it's true of, believe it or not, certain kinds of incense, certain foods, certain drinks. When we play Angola at my house with my buddies, we listen to African and Cuban music. It just helps me go there.
There's one person on Twitter who was playing the coin games and cooking a meal from that culture for each.
Yes, Luke, the board game cook. I really recommend his Twitter account. It's awesome. I love what he does. I hope to have him on the show to have a cooking segment. Would be awesome. He's really, really cool.
Anyone else have a different answer than Volko? I would say my answer is the same. I just try to listen to whatever it is that would transport me to the setting of the game.
Yeah,
mine's pretty. Yeah. Mine's the same, but I just want to shout out to one thing in particular, because I was playing a lot of Fire Emblem Lake, listening to a lot of like classic, Vietnam War rock songs and so on, which is like really, really my jam. But then I thought, this is just really the kind of US perspective on it. So I looked in a bit more, and there's a bunch of interesting folk music, but I also found this really fascinating album of Cambodian rock from 65 to 70 or so. Wow. And there's an interesting story here. So these were people listening to the radio from the US bases, basically, and then creating their own music, mixing in their own folk music. And then the tragic ending to it is they were mostly all killed by the Khmer Rouge. So this scene didn't really get to blossom, but I think it's a really, it's quite raw, it's quite rough music, but it's a really like fascinating insight into how US and kind of international culture intermingled with local folk music. So that's one I was just really pleased to find. And I asked Fred to stick it into the chat because I can't do that. But
yeah, I will do that. And I have one recommendation. If you play a Gest of Robin Hood, and something that I've done for all my design work is I have a pretty extensive playlist of bardcore covers on YouTube. So it's basically a popular song from our era, made in the style of using medieval instruments. Extremely fun, really good to focus. And when playing Nevsky, I like to listen to Prokofiev because I think it's pretty epic, and that would be my recommendation too. And I'm going to put Joe's link in the chat in a second.
So with that, that's going to be the end of our panel for GenCon Online 2021. Thank you, everybody, for your great questions and for the engagement in the chat. If you have any more questions about these games and want information, there are pages on gmtgames.com where you can pre-order the games that we talked about or order existing Coin Series games. Board Game Geek has pages for nearly all of these games. And again, as Fred mentioned, if you're passionate about the Coin Series or ICS, I would strongly recommend joining the Coin Series Players Club Discord. There's 1,000 people there and just a great community. So thank you, Volko, Fred, Saverio, Joe. Appreciate your time and your thoughts. And everybody enjoy the rest of GenCon Online. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.